The autumn rain hammered against the tin roof of the makeshift training facility outside Fort Benning, Georgia. Inside, a dozen military instructors sat in folding chairs, their arms crossed, faces showing various degrees of skepticism and boredom. At the front of the room stood James Mackenzie, a wiry British man in his early 50s. His weathered hands gripping a pointer stick like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Nobody wanted to be there. That much was clear. James had flown from Manchester 3 days earlier, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, a tattered notebook, and a reputation that preceded him like a bad smell. The year was 1943, and the United States Army was deep into World War II, hungry for any tactical advantage they could find. British intelligence had sent James as part of a knowledge exchange program, insisting he had something valuable to teach about urban warfare and concealment tactics. The Americans were not convinced. Sergeant Raymond Dutch sat in the back row, his thick Georgia accent already primed for mockery. He leaned over to his colleague, muttering just loud enough for others to hear. "That Brit looks like he couldn't fight his way out of a wet paper bag. What's he gonna teach us? How to drink tea while the enemy reloads." Laughter rippled through the room. James heard it. He always heard it. He had spent the last 2 years being dismissed, ignored, and ridiculed. His methods were considered outdated, impractical, absurd even. The shed false wall method, as he called it, was his life's work. A sniper concealment technique he had developed during years of studying architecture, hunting, and guerrilla warfare. It involved creating a false wall inside an existing structure, usually a barn or shed, where a marksman could position himself completely invisible to anyone searching the building. The wall looked real, felt real, but behind it was a narrow cavity with firing slots disguised as natural gaps in the wood. Everyone thought it was ridiculous. Too complicated, they said. Too slow to set up. Too obvious. Why hide in a wall when you could just hide in the woods like a normal sniper? James had tried to explain it 100 times. Urban environments were different. Forests were being cleared. Buildings were becoming the new battlegrounds. Soldiers needed to adapt. But nobody listened. Not in Manchester. Not in London. And certainly not here in Georgia, where men like Sergeant Dutch believed the only way to fight was loud, fast, and with overwhelming firepower. "All right, settle down," barked Colonel Howard, a stocky man with a crew cut and a permanent scowl. He stood near the door, arms folded across his chest. "Mr. Mackenzie has been sent here by our allies, and we're going to give him the courtesy of listening. Even if his ideas sound like something out of a fantasy novel." More snickers. James cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "Gentlemen, I know you think this is a waste of time. I know you have better things to do. But I assure you what I'm about to show you could save lives. A lot of them." Sergeant Dutch raised his hand, not waiting to be called on. "With all due respect, sir, we've been training snipers for years. We know how to shoot. We know how to hide. What exactly do you think you're going to teach us that we don't already know?" James met his gaze. "I'm going to teach you how to become invisible in plain sight. How to position yourself in a place where the enemy will search and still never find you. How to take out high-value targets in the middle of enemy territory and walk away without a scratch." Dutch grinned. "Sounds like magic to me." "It's not magic," James said quietly. "It's patience. It's precision. And it's something I've done successfully 17 times in urban combat situations across Europe." The room went quieter, but the skepticism remained thick as fog. Colonel Howard checked his watch. "All right, Mackenzie, you've got 2 hours to convince us. After that, you're on the first plane back to England. No hard feelings, but we don't have time for theories. We need results." James nodded. He had expected nothing less. He spent the next hour explaining the shed false wall method in excruciating detail. He drew diagrams on a chalkboard, showed photographs of previous setups, explained sightlines, bullet trajectory, escape routes, and material requirements. He talked about weight distribution, sound dampening, and how to make the false wall blend seamlessly with the rest of the structure. The instructors listened, but their expressions never changed. A few took notes out of politeness. Most just stared at the clock. When James finished, Sergeant Dutch stood up, stretched, and shook his head. I'll be honest with you, Mackenzie. That sounds like the most overcomplicated nonsense I've ever heard. You want us to spend hours building a fake wall inside a shed just so one guy can sit there and maybe get one shot off? We could just blow the whole place up and move on. Others nodded in agreement. Colonel Howard sighed. All right, Mackenzie. I appreciate the effort, but I think we're done here. This just isn't practical for the kind of warfare we're engaged in. James stood there, rain still pounding the roof above, his hands trembling slightly. He had been dismissed again, mocked again, sent away again. But then he said something that changed everything. Let me show you. Colonel Howard raised an eyebrow. Show us what exactly? James straightened his posture, fighting against every instinct telling him to just pack his bag and leave. Give me 3 days. Let me build one setup in a training structure here on base. Then run a full search exercise with your best men. If they find me before I take my shots, I'll leave and never bother you again. If they don't, you listen to what I have to teach. The room erupted in laughter. Sergeant Dutch slapped his knee. You want us to waste 3 days watching you play carpenter? Man, you really are desperate. Colonel Howard held up a hand, silencing the room. His eyes narrowed as he studied James. You're serious about this? Completely serious. The colonel glanced at his watch again, then at the rain-soaked windows. He seemed to be calculating something in his head. 3 days. You build your little hiding spot. We send in a full squad to search the building. If you can stay hidden and take simulated shots at designated targets without being found, we'll consider your method. Fair? James nodded. Fair. Dutch leaned forward, his grin widening. And when we find you in the first 10 minutes, you buy drinks for everyone here. Deal? Deal. The bet was set. The instructors filed out of the room, most of them laughing and shaking their heads. James heard their comments as they left. Poor bastard has no idea what he's gotten himself into. Our boys will tear that shed apart. This is going to be embarrassing. Only Colonel Howard remained behind. He approached James with a hard expression. I'm giving you this chance because London insisted you were worth listening to. But I'm telling you right now, Mackenzie, if this is some kind of stunt, if you waste our time and resources, you'll be persona non grata in every Allied military facility from here to Berlin. Understood? James met his gaze without flinching. Understood. The next morning, James was escorted to an old storage shed on the edge of the training grounds. It was about 20 feet long, 15 feet wide, with wooden walls and a corrugated metal roof. Inside were old crates, farming tools, and years of accumulated dust. It looked like 100 other sheds scattered across rural Georgia. Perfect. James was given basic carpentry tools, some scrap lumber, nails, and paint. No special equipment. No military-grade materials. Just what any farmer might have in his barn. He worked alone. The instructors had made it clear they weren't interested in helping. Sergeant Dutch walked by twice a day, always with some smug comment. How's the magic wall coming along? Mackenzie? Need some pixie dust? James ignored him. He measured, cut, fitted, and painted with the precision of a surgeon. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, creating something that looked entirely ordinary but was anything but. By the end of the second day, the false wall was complete. From the inside of the shed, it looked like nothing had changed. The wall appeared solid, aged, identical to the rest of the structure. But behind it, James had created a space just wide enough for a man to lie down, with carefully positioned gaps that looked like natural weathering but provided perfect firing angles. On the morning of the third day, Colonel Howard assembled his best squad outside the shed. Time to find our British ghost. The squad consisted of 8 men, all seasoned soldiers with combat experience. They had been briefed the night before. Search the shed, find Mackenzie, and prove that his method was nothing more than wishful thinking. They were motivated, confident, and eager to embarrass the British instructor who had wasted their time. Sergeant Dutch led the team. He stood outside the shed with his arms crossed, addressing his men like they were about to storm an enemy bunker. All right, boys, this is simple. 1 man, 1 shed, nowhere to go. We search top to bottom, wall to wall. When we find him, and we will find him, I want you to remember this moment. Remember what happens when someone tries to sell us snake oil. The men nodded, checking their training rifles. They would use blanks, but the exercise was designed to be as realistic as possible. Mackenzie would be armed with a rifle loaded with blanks as well. If he managed to get shots off before being discovered, observers would note which targets he hit. Colonel Howard stood 50 yards away with a stopwatch and a clipboard. Several other instructors gathered around him, placing informal bets on how long it would take to find the Brit. Most gave it 5 minutes. Nobody gave it more than 15. Dutch kicked open the shed door with unnecessary force. "Move in." The squad entered in standard formation, rifles raised, sweeping every corner with practiced efficiency. They checked behind crates, under tarps, in the rafters. They knocked on walls, listening for hollow sounds. They poked at the floor with rifle butts, searching for trapdoors. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. Dutch's confidence began to waver. He ordered his men to search again, more thoroughly this time. They dismantled crates, moved every piece of equipment, checked the same corners twice. They even climbed onto the roof to see if Mackenzie had somehow squeezed into the space between the ceiling and the metal sheeting. Still nothing. Outside, the instructors stopped laughing. Colonel Howard checked his stopwatch. 22 minutes. Inside the shed, Dutch was sweating. He walked the perimeter again, running his hands along the walls, feeling for inconsistencies. Everything seemed solid. Everything seemed real. Where the hell could he be? Then it happened. A single blank round echoed through the shed. Dutch spun around, rifle raised, but saw nothing. No movement, no figure, no British sniper. Another shot, then another, then another. The shots were coming from inside the shed, but Dutch couldn't see the shooter. His men scrambled, pointing their rifles in every direction, shouting confused commands at each other. 9 shots total. Each one carefully aimed through the disguised gaps in the false wall. Each one hitting a designated target outside the shed where officers had been positioned as part of the simulation. When the shooting stopped, Colonel Howard walked to the shed entrance. His face was unreadable. "Mackenzie, show yourself." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a section of the wall that everyone had checked, touched, and dismissed as solid began to move. James emerged from behind it, covered in dust, holding his rifle, looking exhausted but vindicated. The squad stood frozen, staring at the wall they had examined multiple times without suspecting anything. If you are watching this and wondering how he did it, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel because what happens next will change everything you think you know about warfare. The silence in the shed was deafening. Sergeant Dutch stared at the false wall, his face cycling through disbelief, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like respect. He had touched that wall. He had knocked on it. He had declared it solid. Colonel Howard stepped inside, walking slowly toward the concealment. He ran his hand along the edge where the false wall met the real structure. The craftsmanship was flawless. The paint matched perfectly. The wood grain aligned. Even the accumulated dust and cobwebs had been replicated. "How long were you in there?" James wiped sweat from his forehead. "Since 0400 this morning. 6 hours. You didn't move? Didn't make a sound?" "Not once. That's part of the method. Patience is everything." The colonel examined the firing slots. They were positioned at natural weak points in the wood, places where weathering would normally create gaps. Unless you knew exactly what to look for, they were invisible. "Show me how you built this." Over the next hour, James dismantled sections of the false wall, explaining every detail. He showed them how to create the frame, how to match existing materials, how to calculate sightlines, how to position yourself for maximum effectiveness and minimal detection. He explained the psychology of it, how searchers expect to find anomalies, so the key was creating something that looked more real than reality itself. The instructors who had mocked him that first day now crowded around, asking questions, taking notes. Even Sergeant Dutch had gone quiet, studying the construction with the intensity of a man who had just learned something that might save his life. Colonel Howard pulled James aside. "I owe you an apology." "We all do." James shook his head. "No apology necessary. I understand the skepticism. I faced it everywhere. The colonel's expression hardened with determination. I want you to train 20 men, our best snipers. Teach them everything you know. We have 2 weeks before they ship out to the European theater. Can you do it? For the first time in years, James felt something close to hope. I can do it. The training began the next morning. James worked 16-hour days, teaching soldiers how to see buildings not as structures but as opportunities, how to identify the perfect concealment locations, how to build false walls quickly with whatever materials were available, how to remain motionless for hours, how to calculate firing angles in urban environments. The men who had laughed at him now hung on his every word. Sergeant Dutch became one of his most dedicated students, admitting privately that he had underestimated the British instructor. Word spread through Fort Benning. Other units requested the training. Officers from different branches came to observe. What had started as a humiliating demonstration had become something else entirely, a revolution in sniper tactics. But the real test would come overseas, where buildings were bombed, walls were crumbling, and enemy soldiers were searching for American snipers with lethal determination. 6 months later, reports began filtering back from France. Colonel Howard sat in his office at Fort Benning, reading field intelligence with growing astonishment. A sniper unit trained in Mackenzie's method had been deployed to a contested village outside Cannes. German forces had occupied the area for weeks, and Allied command needed reconnaissance on enemy officer movements. Sergeant Raymond Dutch had volunteered for the mission. According to the after-action report, Dutch and 2 other trained snipers had entered a partially destroyed barn on the village outskirts. Using rubble, damaged wood, and materials scavenged from nearby buildings, they constructed 3 false wall positions in under 4 hours. German patrols searched the barn twice over the next 36 hours, finding nothing. During that time, Dutch's team observed and reported critical intelligence on German supply routes, officer positions, and defensive weaknesses. When the moment came, Dutch took 9 shots in rapid succession, eliminating a gathering of high-ranking German officers who had assumed the barn was secure. The German response was immediate and furious. Soldiers tore through the barn, searching for the shooters. They found empty rooms, scattered debris, and walls that seemed completely solid. Dutch and his team remained hidden, controlling their breathing, frozen in their concealed positions, while enemy soldiers stood inches away from their hiding spots. After 2 hours, the Germans gave up and retreated, convinced the shots had come from a different location entirely. The 3 Americans waited until nightfall, then slipped out and made their way back to Allied lines. The mission was deemed one of the most successful sniper operations of the campaign. Back at Fort Benning, Colonel Howard immediately sent word to James, who was now training a 3rd group of snipers. The British instructor received the news while standing in another shed, teaching another group of skeptical young soldiers. When Howard read the report aloud, the room went silent. James felt something he had not felt in years. Vindication. Not the bitter kind born from proving people wrong, but the profound kind that comes from knowing your work saved lives. Dutch returned stateside 2 months later, decorated and promoted. The first thing he did was find James. The 2 men met in the same training facility where they had first clashed. Dutch extended his hand, and James shook it. "I was wrong about you, Mackenzie. Dead wrong. Your method saved my life and the lives of my men. I'll never forget that." James nodded, his voice quiet as always. "I'm just glad it worked." Dutch smiled. "Worked? Hell, it's being taught at every sniper school in the Allied forces now. You've changed the game." The shed false wall method became standard training. Manuals were written. Diagrams were distributed. Soldiers across multiple armies learned the technique that everyone had once mocked. James Mackenzie, the quiet British instructor who had been dismissed and ridiculed, had created something that would influence military tactics for generations. But for James, the greatest reward was simpler than all of that. It was knowing that somewhere in Europe, in barns and sheds and ruined buildings, soldiers were staying alive because he had refused to give up. 3 years after the war ended, James Mackenzie returned to Fort Benning one final time. He was 61 now, his hair completely gray, his movements slower but still deliberate. The base had changed significantly. New buildings, new technology, new faces. But the legacy of what he had taught remained embedded in every sniper program across the United States military. Colonel Howard, now a general, had invited him for a ceremony. James had resisted at first, never comfortable with attention or recognition, but Howard had insisted. The ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in 1948. Over 200 soldiers, instructors, and officers gathered in the main auditorium. Among them sat Raymond Dutch, now a captain and head of the Advanced Sniper Training Program. General Howard stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the room. In 1943, a man came to us with an idea that seemed impossible. We mocked him. We dismissed him. We told him his method would never work in real combat. We were wrong. He gestured to a display behind him showing photographs from the war. Images of soldiers using concealment techniques in France, Belgium, Germany, and Italy. Statistics showing successful missions, lives saved, intelligence gathered. The shed false wall method developed by James Mackenzie has been credited with saving an estimated 400 Allied lives during the war. It has been used in 63 documented operations with a 91% success rate. It has become foundational training for sniper units in 7 Allied nations. The audience applauded. James sat in the front row, uncomfortable with the attention, his hands folded in his lap. Howard continued. But more than the tactical success, Mr. Mackenzie taught us something else. He taught us that innovation often comes from the most unexpected places, that the quietest voices sometimes carry the most important messages, and that persistence in the face of ridicule is the mark of true courage. More applause, louder this time. After the ceremony, soldiers lined up to meet James, to shake his hand, to thank him. Many were young men who had been trained in his method and credited it with bringing them home alive. Some brought photographs of themselves in concealment positions overseas. Others brought handwritten notes from fellow soldiers who could not attend. Captain Dutch approached last. He handed James a wooden plaque with an engraving, "To the man who taught us to disappear in plain sight." With gratitude and respect, James accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you, Raymond, for giving me a chance when nobody else would." Dutch smiled. "No, sir. Thank you for not giving up on us." James returned to Manchester shortly after, living quietly in a small cottage with his wife Margaret. He never sought fame or fortune from his work. He spent his remaining years gardening, reading, and occasionally corresponding with soldiers who wrote to him from around the world. He passed away peacefully in 1957, at the age of 70. But his legacy lived on in every military manual, every training program, every soldier who learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not firepower, but the ability to become invisible.